generalized epidemics in Eastern and Southern Africa. I should also say that anything that I say is only my personal view and in no way reflects USAID or the U.S. government. So I think I was asked to be here in hopes that I would be a bit constructively challenging, and I hope that I can do that and make it a little interesting. My bottom line, however, is that I do think treatment as prevention can be an important component of prevention. In fact, I think it already probably is having some impact, and I certainly hope it is. But I also think it's vulnerable in a sense, and I also think it really can't do it on its own, and that if we really want to have an HIV-free generation, we really need to be strengthening all of our major approaches to prevention. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Now, one major difference that I think I haven't really heard anybody say so far is that I do think programmatically, in all likelihood, there's a major difference between treatment of people that are already symptomatic, provision who perceive that they have no immediate problem and are not symptomatic. And therefore, we have to be a bit careful about how we might extrapolate our evidence from the former to the latter. And I definitely think that obviously treatment of people with lower CD4 counts not only makes good treatment humanitarian sense, but I also think it's the most likely to have impact because they're the most infectious. But I also think there's a major pitfall in that folks that are not at that stage are much less likely to be adherent and compliant with the regimens we might want to offer them, and people really ought to think about that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the epidemic and the generalized epidemics, which is something that, in a sense, Paul alluded to. Sometimes I feel like our tendency has been to there's a bunch of sort of HIV-infected people there that are transmitting, and our job is to sort of try and find them and deal with that in a humanitarian way. So it's kind of a search and contain strategy. And I think that that's fine in a way, but I think it's important to recognize that there is also a rather moving component to these epidemics that really is not amenable to that. It's almost like there's sort of a tortoise and a hare transmission process. And if that's the case, I really believe it is, the search really isn't going to do as much as we need to have done. And part of my thinking that reinforces this is not just that Rakai shows a higher rate of transmission during acute infection, or that SIV, the animal model, really shows the same thing, but also it's really very hard. I've never been able to satisfy myself where these epidemics, generalized epidemics, come from by any other reasonable mechanism other than interaction actually of acute infection and such all the modeling indicates that these epidemics had a very steep origin. There weren't very many people with advanced disease to cause much infection, and infection rates are pretty low in chronic disease, so acute infection seems to me had to play a major role. The other major piece of evidence is that there are now several of these phylogenetic studies in MSM epidemics, which to me are actually pretty convincing that kind of bursts and clusters of these infections do occur in these epidemics, and we really ought to be trying to address that problem. Again, it calls for prevention that tries to kind of reduce the temperature, if you will, of transmission in general overall. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the analogues to the Cascade phenomenon, as I think of Sub-Saharan Africa, just a few of them, and where I think it might take us in terms of this approach. First of all, the project Accepted, published in Lancet, Infectious Disease, I guess it was, basically after 3 years of intervention, I'm talking about intervention, what they got was 44% of the population to accept. Now, he was making the case, well, that's really good. It's a lot better than the conventional way, but it's also a very long way from the kind of fairly high levels that we often see in modeling. And it's even worse than that because, the 56% that didn't, they're resistant. The next 3 years, you'll get another 44% of that 56%. And it's even worse than that because it turns out that, at least there's a couple of good studies that show that the people that don't come for testing are more likely to be HIV positive than the people that do. Oh, great. Just briefly, linkage to care, the paper by Rosen and Fox, meta-analysis or review, indicates about 68% of people identified who are eligible, and these are older studies, that means CD4 200 eligible, actually make it into care. So that's the analog from the developing world. But there's a couple of other studies that are really pretty striking. There's a study by Katz from South Africa that found that 20% of the treatment-eligible people with average CD4 count of 110 refused treatment, even when they were followed up 2 months later. So the main reason that they gave was no symptoms. So, I do think we need research on these kind of questions, by the way, that it's not just a matter of doing a randomized trial to find out the output. We need to get inside of people's heads to some extent to find out what's going on. Another important key piece of data was presented at CROI by the Partners in Prevention data by Heffron. Basically, the poster was about acceptance of ARVs among discordant couples for the HIV positive partner, CD4 over 350. And 40%, these are couples that came forward to be in this, basically in this trial situation. 40% of them, the HIV positive partner, was not interested and refused treatment. So again, these are not good harbingers necessarily. These are really good case situations, but it really presents some problems. I'm going to, in the interest of time, sort of skip over some of these other things like continuation and adherence. But one problem we have with continuation is, say for example, if you look at data on sort of the previous history of people on treatment, Malawi has national data, which is fairly representative, I suppose. 12.5 at 1 year, 12.5% mortality, 10% lost to follow-up, 8% transferred to another clinic site. We don't know. Only 0.2 actually discontinued. But the point is, you can't then just say, okay, well then, continuation is going to be 99.8%, because in fact, that set of folks who died, who lost to follow-up, who switched, are very likely there's some substantial number who, if they had higher CD4 counts, wouldn't die at that same rate, but still might well be lost to follow-up. The other two big issues are actually costs, which people have already raised. 2 points on cost. I think it's going to be hugely expensive just to get to either the 13 million or the 15 million of people that are treatment eligible, even at the 350 count. And again, I think that should be our priority for prevention as well. Those objectives are very close together. What makes me nervous is when people start talking about getting above those counts for a population impact. The other thing is that when you scale up, the economists talk about there's this sort of S-curve problem, that you can't assume that economies of scales are going to kind of continue ad infinitum, if you will. At some point, your infrastructure isn't good enough, and the clientele you're trying to reach is difficult, and there's sort of a point of diminishing returns. And the last thing I want to mention is something that's been mentioned a couple of times, which is risk compensation. And here I would say that risk compensation really could be kind of a game changer here. Just to point out that risk compensation really has two components. One component is risk compensation on the person on ARVs. The other is what's sometimes called treatment optimism or HIV complacency among people who in the general public think, oh, well, ARVs are around, so I don't necessarily need to worry so much about risk behavior. I think we're fortunate that people in the current cohorts on ARVs do have low risk behavior. Part of it, I think, is because there's some counseling going on. They generally don't want to infect other people, but a lot of it is also because they're sick. And you know, they may not have partners. A lot of them are sort of older women who may not even have partners. But we're fortunate in that regard. But I think if we get into a situation where a lot of people on ARVs over a longer period of time, and even though there's some reassuring evidence on this, we could see that the rates of because I think most people would agree that that's been the major problem in the MSM epidemics and why we have not seen declines in a number of the MSM dominated epidemics. Okay, so those are all sort of worrisome things I've told you. I want to tell you a few good. I think there will be new and better ARVs. I don't think that will necessarily save us, but I do think that that will, you know, longer-acting ARVs and so forth. I do think that will help with some of these issues. I think South Africa of ARV coverage among their CD4 less than 200 population, according to a paper by Leigh Johnson that's just come out. So that's really good news. I also think we also have the major good news that and it's declining especially among young women, and I'm optimistic that that will continue because of behavior change and conduct. Point about male circumcision, consistent condom use, and partner limitation behavior risk. And one of my main concerns is I feel like behavior change to reduce risk and reduce partners has actually kind of gone out of popularity. You know, how do we know? It seems costly. What do we know about it? My view is that it is evidence-based, certainly as I define evidence, and that we are continuing to strengthen risky reduction behavior change. Related to that, I would ask you what the following have in condom. Adherence, risk compensation, uptake, testing, acceptance, and continuation. All right. The answer is behavior change. I mean, if you want to deal with this cascade, we are going to have to deal with continuation. And in my view, though, the bedrock that we really can't lose is our efforts to reduce risky behavior. So I think I'll pretty much wrap it up. My biggest concern is actually that we may put too many eggs in this treatment as prevention basket. My worry is that there'll be too much pressure to reach those treatment numbers, too much zeal that that's sort of our objective. People say, well, it's okay. It's prevention also. We're doing prevention at the same time, that we may lose what we should be actually increasing in the other prevention modalities. I do want to mention that people proudly point out that under PEPFAR, we've, and rightly so, increased treatment by 4 million, and it's now 6.6 million or even more. But of course, if you do the simple math, since the beginning of PEPFAR, roughly 20 million people have gotten infected. So just come back again, if we really want to do something about that, we really need to be doing a full court press of all prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and I'm glad to announce that Stephen is also here. Welcome, Stephen. We were worried about you. Stephen is also, as I told you, he's a co-director of the AIDS-Free World, and is going to give his perspective on treatment as prevention implementation. Steve.
Thank you. You need never worry about my absence when there's a microphone in sight. I want to thank Julio and his colleagues for the privilege of participating. I start with 3 disclaimers. First, like Jim, I don't really have slides to show. I'm a hopeless techno-peasant and would never undertake it. Secondly, I'm entirely out of my depth. I'm a rank amateur in the presence of scientific excellence. You will be relieved, however, to know that that will not prevent me from speaking. I learned a very long time ago never to allow an absence of knowledge to impede opinion, and I shall therefore feel relatively self-confident about disgorging what I came to disgorge. And finally, I'm reeling from the encyclopedic range of interventions thus far, and I'm striving for coherence, and I'm not at all sure that I can achieve it. I want to start with Ambassador Gooseby, who talked of the end game. It bothers me, Eric, to say Ambassador Gooseby. I used to be an ambassador, believe it or not, when I represented Canada at the United Nations, but in Canada, unlike the United States, when you end your diplomatic tenure, you lose your title, and you revert to mortal obscurity again. It's only in the United States, once an ambassador, always an ambassador, once a senator, always a senator, once a president, always a president. They are sustained by their own self-amplification. I think it's true that, as Eric said, 1 year ago, we would never have used the phrase, the end game. And I want to come back to Tony Fauci, who preceded the remarks you saw on the screen with the words that treatment is prevention, absolutely confirmed in the data. And he went on to say that those who had argued it before were right all along. And that was a tribute to the studies that emerged in 2006, 2008, 2010. Now, Tony Fauci is perhaps not sacred, but he's certainly celestial. And one has to take his words with a certain seriousness. And there will now be many collaborative studies. I'm familiar with the study that is taking place in KwaZulu-Natal, in Swaziland over the next 3 years, in a kind of ecological study. I love the phrase. The Clinton Health Access Initiative, in conjunction with Stop AIDS Now, a Dutch NGO whose executive director, Louise Van Deth, is here, will be doing 3 years of what amounts to test and treat in a way which may provide the ultimate confirmation in a country which is said to have the highest prevalence rate in the world. I have 3 broad areas of comment which flow from that indecipherable background. First, resting on a quote from Paul Delay, how far we have come and how fast this has occurred in the last 30 years. Well, yes and no. There are significant chunks of HIV history that involve delay, passivity, and lost opportunity in the response. And it galls me and it depresses me, and I think it's terribly important when conjuring up our response to treatment as prevention not to forget what happened over the years. For example, 3x5 emerged much more slowly than it should have emerged because of internal UN rivalries. And if forced to explain, I'm happy to do so, because I was the UN envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa at the time and watched this evolve. But it was heartbreaking to see the numbers that died unnecessarily because of the internal and endemic rivalries to which the United Nations is sometimes addicted. Second, male circumcision should have accelerated years ago. All you have to do is read the new book called Tinderbox by Crave Timberg and Daniel Halpern, where even Peter Piot in the book admits that he should perhaps have taken it all more seriously and moved more vigorously. And it is important that, as Eric said, supported hugely by PEPFAR, male circumcision is now significantly underway with a potential 68% effect on transmission, reduction of transmission, but it is very, very late in the day. Third, the greatest calamity of all was vertical transmission. And that I can speak to fairly authoritatively because I watched UNICEF drop the ball, and there wasn't from, again, in other parts of the UN system, the kind of urgency that would have moved that forward in a way which would have made a much greater qualitative difference earlier. And that is painful, but it is true, and it's necessary to recognize, therefore, that there were multilateral and national impediments to the rolling out of the response to HIV over the years, which cost tremendous numbers of lives. The vortex, of course, was South Africa. The denialism was Thabo Mbeki. And I remind you that no one, but no one, at the most senior levels of multilateralism ever called Thabo Mbeki to account over all of the years that he was committing crimes against humanity. Well, his citizens died on his watch. Indeed, if you look at the study done by Harvard and the study done by the Social Research Council in South Africa, some 330,000 to 350,000 people died unnecessarily on his watch, and the world did not call him to account. It was done behind the scenes in private, but never the kind of confrontation that we so frequently do in other areas. So that leads me to the second of the three broad domains, which is to beg you not to let it happen with treatment as preventions. The new studies are good. They will sharpen the lens, but there were three comments by Eric Goosby, from Eric Goosby, which I frankly cherish, and that will probably discombobulate Eric Goosby because he would not wish my rapturous adoration. The first was his comment that there is a moment in which we must act. I'm quoting him directly. The second was, we cannot wait until the studies are done. The third was, do we move then to scale, or do we identify sub-problems, but have the courage to take the steps to implement and modify, or dismantle and reconstruct where necessary? To have the courage to implement, to take the steps. And those three quotes, and I don't think I'm doing Eric a violation, summarized a terribly important reality of not allowing ourselves to get overridden by the ever constant necessity to do more and more and more studies while waiting for the implementation. And here I venture into very precipitous terrain. I think that WHO needs that courage to implement. I don't believe that Gottfried, I don't direct these comments to Gottfried, because I know the way agencies work. And I know that unless you have the imprimatur of urgency or legitimacy right at the top, nothing fully gets done in multilateralism. But I want to remember Tony Fauci's remarks from the YouTube video. Quote, "Some people don't get it. They say this was done with discordant couples. True, but if you're infected and you're having sex with an uninfected person, that's a discordant couple. Take the data and run with it." Well, I want to encourage WHO to run with it. I read carefully the guidelines on the couples. Gottfried, you said partners in your last slide, wanting with great intellectual dexterity to shift us to recognize that it was more than couples. But your guidelines say HIV testing and counseling for couples. And that literal transliteration of the 052 study seems to me to do a slight disservice to the point that Tony Fauci was making, which is understand that the 96% reduction that we saw applies across the board and should therefore be applied to all. And while I think it's a terrific first step, I wish it were slightly less timorous in quality. And I feel the same way about the guidelines on vertical transmission. I want to say with some feeling that you don't have to have a doctorate in epidemiology to know that option B and B plus were inexorable and preferable to option A. And that was true the moment that they were put forward, because it was a matter of money, it was a matter of dollars, as well as a matter of the actual regimen of treatment that was being applied. And I don't doubt for a moment that option B and option B plus will be embraced. That's absolutely inevitable. And why do I make those points about WHO? I want to say something personally here. I had quite a personal battle with WHO in the days when we were dealing with Nestle's and infant feeding. And when UNICEF, and I was the Deputy Executive Director for International Programming, desperately wanted 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding, and WHO, somewhat enchanted with the infant formula companies, and Nestle's in particular, we're talking of 4 months. And it took a fairly serious battle royal to get it to the 6 months, and to make everyone understand that the International Code for the Marketing of Breast Milk Substitute should be taken seriously. And I learned then that it's very important to hold your ground when making efforts with some of the international context. And that leads me to the third and final point I wanted to make, which was that after this meeting is over, and I hope that we've all taken the guidelines, which I admit are a concrete first step, and taken them, I hope, further, and treatment as prevention is sanctified by this auspicious group, but that we have to move on the financing. That while this room is filled with researchers and scientists and academics and professionals of every art and practice, it's important, I think, to lend your advocacy to freeing the money. The Global Fund is in terrible difficulty. The internal putsch, which resulted in the departure of the previous executive director, is now resulting in questionable internal reformation. Watch it, because huge amounts of money are at stake. PEPFAR seems to be flourishing, but PEPFAR received a cutback in the president's most recent budgetary statement, which isn't a worry to PEPFAR, because Eric Gooseby has $1.46 billion of retained monies in his pockets, which can be repositioned within PEPFAR in places where there is urgency and need. The reference earlier to the European Union and India and the trade agreement is putting at risk the generic drugs. This is not a minor proposition. This is a terribly anxious proposition. For the last 2 years, I've had the privilege of sitting on something called the Commission on HIV and the Law, which was appointed by the United Nations Development Program, and there are 15 commissioners from around the world. We've now finished our report. It will be launched by the Secretary General of the United Nations on July the 9th in advance of the International AIDS Conference. I think it's fair to say, without revealing the content, that we've made the most dramatic, if I wore my social democratic hat, I would say radical recommendations on intellectual property rights that have ever emerged from a UN document. And I say to Nora Valco that she will be very pleased on what we have said about drugs and substance abuse. But in truth, the regimen, the possibility of drugs, generic, low cost, is in peril. And finding alternative methods of financing, conceivably through the International Financial Transactions Tax, may well be something that we should all pursue. MSF has already put out a monograph indicating the consequences at the grassroots of the diminution in money and the way in which it is affecting treatment. We tend in discussions of treatment as prevention, and I'll end here, to talk of drugs. And I understand Jim's comments about not wanting to put all the eggs in one basket, but that's like standing at the shore, like Canute, and saying to the waves, stop. The momentum around treatment as prevention is too strong. The words of Hillary Clinton and President Obama are reverberating around the world. The impact of the 052 study on top of all the work that was done in the years before, which 052 simply confirmed. It's all too forceful. There's no way of stopping it, so let us do it well, and let us defeat the pandemic in the process. I liked the way Eric stopped in the early part of his speech to point out the human sensibilities. Fewer children orphaned, fewer jobs lost, life expectancy climbing again, women hours saved in caregiving, resurgence of professionals and skilled laborers, the growth of gross domestic product, women whose progress was deferred by the long period devoted to maintaining families and societies can now get back to productive lives. Everything turns around and the catastrophic implications can be reversed. I love the possibilities. I spent, like so many of you, 6 years of my life watching people die, and it's beyond the realm of comprehension to think that we can now bring it to an end. Thank you.